No one in the room read the documents all the way through. Not because they were careless, but because nothing in the room suggested danger. The lights were white and even. The table was clean. The papers were neatly stacked, clipped, aligned. Everything looked official in a way that felt reassuring. The man sat slightly away from the center. Not by choice. It was simply where the chair had been placed. His sleeves were rolled up just enough to be comfortable. He had already been working for several hours that morning. This meeting was not meant to be memorable. At the far end of the table, someone spoke calmly. A voice trained to avoid emphasis. Certain sections were indicated with a pen. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual. This is required. The phrases were familiar. They had been used many times before, in many rooms like this one. No one asked for clarification. No one interrupted. A pen was slid across the table. It was not new. The plastic casing was slightly scratched. The kind of pen that circulates between offices, contracts, hands. The man picked it up and paused. Only briefly. Not because he sensed risk, but because his attention had drifted. He was thinking about the apartment he had seen the week before. About the first month's rent. About the feeling, quiet but persistent, that his life was finally moving forward. He signed the first page quickly. The second page took longer. The third even longer. By the fourth, his eyes no longer tracked the text. They followed the margins. The spacing. His signature repeated itself. Consistent. Practiced. There was no announcement when he finished. No acknowledgement. The papers were gathered and stacked again. Placed into a folder. The conversation shifted. Someone mentioned traffic. Someone else mentioned the weather. Chairs moved back. Hands were shaken. The meeting dissolved without a clear ending. No one in that room knew that something irreversible had just occurred. Not because the moment was dramatic, but because it wasn't. There was no sense of crossing a line. No signal that anything had closed behind him. What had changed did not change immediately. It would not show itself that day. Or the next. It would not arrive as a shock. It would arrive slowly, through consequences that appeared unrelated, through options that quietly disappeared, through explanations that would later feel incomplete. Nothing about the moment felt final. And that was the problem. Because from that point forward, every step he would take would be interpreted through what he had just signed. Not by people. By systems. By processes that do not reconsider intention. By records that do not remember context. There would be no moment when he was told, explicitly, that his freedom of choice had narrowed. Only a series of outcomes that would begin to feel inevitable. Years later, when this moment was revisited, not by him, but by others, it would look clean. Voluntary. Legal. Documented. Everything done correctly. And nothing that could be undone. He was 36 years old at the time. Not young enough to feel protected by time. Not old enough to feel finished. His job title sounded stable when spoken aloud. Not impressive. Not fragile. It was the kind of job people nodded at. The kind that suggested responsibility without power. He earned enough to live alone without roommates. Enough to pay rent on time. Enough to avoid debt most months. Not enough to build anything that felt permanent. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city. Not temporary housing. Not somewhere he planned to stay forever. The furniture was functional. Nothing matched exactly. Nothing had been chosen with care. A small table near the window doubled as a workspace. A couch that had seen better years faced a blank wall. There were no framed photos. He told himself he would decorate later. His days followed a predictable rhythm. Wake up early. Coffee made at home. Public transit during peak hours. He liked routines. They reduced friction. At work, he arrived before most people. Not to impress anyone, but because it made the day easier. He answered emails methodically. Completed tasks in sequence. Avoided drawing attention. He wasn't passive. He was cautious. Years earlier, he had learned that visibility did not always lead to security. His colleagues were similar. People in their 30s and 40s. Professionals who had learned to manage expectations. They talked about housing prices, healthcare, retirement plans that felt abstract. No one spoke openly about ambition. That had become unfashionable. They spoke instead about balance, sustainability. But most of them were still waiting for something to change. He spoke to his parents once or twice a week. They lived in a quieter place. A town where people stayed longer than they planned to. They worried about him, quietly. Not about danger. About stagnation. His mother asked whether he was happy. He said he was fine. That was not a lie. It was an approximation. He had been married once. It ended without drama. No legal battle. No betrayal. Just two people realizing that stability without direction was not enough. They still exchanged messages on birthdays. Nothing more. He had no children. Not by design. By timing. He assumed there would be time later. On weekends he ran errands. Did laundry. Bought groceries. He met friends occasionally, usually for coffee. Conversations circled familiar territory. Work. Rent. The cost of everything increasing. No one complained loudly. They had learned that complaint without leverage led nowhere. He did not consider himself unlucky. He had avoided major crises. Avoided addiction. Avoided unemployment. In his mind, he was doing things correctly. He had followed the instructions that were never written down. Study something practical. Work steadily. Don't make noise. Don't fall behind. Still, there was a persistent sense of delay. Not failure. Suspension. He noticed it most in quiet moments. Late at night. Early mornings before work. The feeling that life was waiting for something to begin. He did not want wealth. Not status. What he wanted was clarity. A sense that the effort he was making would lead somewhere visible. When the opportunity first appeared, it did not feel disruptive. It arrived as an email. Brief. Professional. The position was adjacent to his current field. More responsibility. More exposure. The salary was higher. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. Enough to change how he calculated the future. The company name was familiar. Not prestigious, but established. He researched it carefully. No scandals. No obvious warnings. The reviews were mixed. Mostly neutral. Some people described long hours. Others described growth. Nothing alarming. The interview process was efficient. 2 calls. 1 in-person meeting. The questions focused on reliability. Adaptability. Commitment. He answered honestly. He spoke about consistency. About working within systems. The interviewers seemed to appreciate that. They asked if he had questions. He asked about stability. The answer was measured but reassuring. The company was restructuring. Expanding certain departments. They needed people willing to commit. Commitment again. The word followed him. He thought about the numbers. The higher rent he could afford. The savings he could finally build. He thought about his parents. How they would stop worrying. He thought about time. At 36, lateral moves began to feel risky. Staying too long in the same place even more so. He did not think of this as escape. He thought of it as alignment. A way to bring effort and outcome closer together. He told a friend about the offer. The friend hesitated. Just read everything carefully, they said. He smiled. Of course he would. He had always been careful. When he accepted the offer, there was no celebration. No announcement. Just a quiet shift in his internal timeline. The company sent paperwork in advance. Several documents. Standard formatting. Legal language. He skimmed them at first. Then read more carefully. He recognized the structure. Confidentiality. Non-compete clauses. Termination conditions. Nothing stood out as extreme. Some sections were dense, some unclear. He made a note to ask if needed, but no one followed up. And the start date approached quickly. He gave notice at his old job. His manager wished him well. No counteroffer. No tension. That should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like crossing a threshold quietly. On his last day, he cleared his desk. It did not take long. He packed a few personal items into a box. He walked out without ceremony. The new job felt close now. Not abstract. He told himself this was progress. Not transformation. Just a reasonable step forward. He did not feel excitement. He felt relief. Relief that something had finally moved. That his life had shifted off pause, even slightly. He could not see what lay ahead. But nothing in his past suggested that careful decisions led to collapse. He had done everything correctly so far. And that belief, that consistency was protection, was still intact. Long before anything went wrong, the system was already in place. Not as a single structure, but as a series of overlapping rules, habits, and assumptions that rarely needed to be explained. It did not announce itself. It did not demand attention. It simply existed. In this environment, stability was not a guarantee. It was a performance. People did not secure their position by excellence alone, but by remaining legible to the system. Predictable. Replaceable. Non-disruptive. From the outside, the system looked neutral. Contracts were standardized. Policies were published. Processes were documented. Everything appeared transparent. But transparency did not mean symmetry. The law recognized agreement, not understanding. If two parties signed, the system assumed parity. Intent did not matter. Context did not matter. Only the mark on the page. This was not a flaw. It was a design choice. Contracts were written to withstand challenge, not to invite comprehension. They were composed in a language that prioritized precision over clarity. Long sentences. Nested clauses. Conditional obligations. They were not meant to deceive. They were meant to endure. In theory, anyone could question a clause. Negotiate terms. Seek counsel. In practice, few did. Not because they were naive. Because the cost of resistance was built in. Asking questions slowed momentum. Requesting changes marked you as difficult. The system did not punish hesitation explicitly. It made hesitation expensive. Time mattered. By the time paperwork arrived, most decisions had already been made. Housing had been arranged. Notice had been given. Social expectations had shifted. The signature came last, but it sealed everything that came before it. There was no mandated pause. No institutional moment that required reflection. You could step back, but you would do so alone, without support, without protection. Workplace culture reinforced this. In meetings, efficiency was valued over deliberation. Questions were welcomed, as long as they did not slow progress. Managers were trained to maintain flow, not to examine foundations. Human resources existed to ensure compliance, not to interpret consequence. Legal departments existed to protect the organization, not to balance understanding. Each role was limited. Each responsibility defined narrowly. No one person saw the whole. And because no single actor caused harm, the system appeared blameless. Power operated indirectly. It did not require threats. It relied on incentives. Advancement depended on alignment. Security depended on silence. Those who adapted moved forward. Those who questioned stalled. Replacement was always implicit. There was always someone waiting. This knowledge circulated quietly. It was not taught. It was absorbed. People learned it by watching others. By seeing who stayed. Who left. Who disappeared. The system also understood timing. New employees were most vulnerable early on. They were eager to prove themselves. Unfamiliar with internal boundaries. Still adjusting to expectations. This was not exploited overtly. It did not need to be. Small deviations accumulated naturally. Responsibilities expanded gradually. Expectations shifted incrementally. Nothing changed abruptly enough to justify alarm. Each step felt reasonable in isolation. Only later did the pattern emerge. The system also externalized risk. Flexibility was framed as opportunity. Availability as dedication. But the cost of flexibility was borne individually. If workloads became unsustainable, that was a capacity issue. If boundaries eroded, that was a communication failure. If something went wrong, responsibility traced back to the point of agreement. The signature. This logic was consistent. Impersonal. It did not care who you were, only what you had agreed to. An agreement was binary. You had signed, or you had not. There was no space for partial consent. No mechanism for renegotiation once embedded. Exit was permitted, but rarely without consequence. Non-compete clauses limited mobility. Termination conditions triggered financial loss. References became guarded. Timelines became suspect. Leaving early suggested instability. Staying too long suggested stagnation. The system offered no ideal path. Only acceptable ones. Media rarely examined this structure. There was nothing scandalous to expose. No corruption. No crime. Only ordinary people operating within rules that appeared fair from a distance. Stories that did surface focused on extremes. Fraud. Abuse. Collapse. They did not cover erosion. They did not document how options disappeared quietly. Because erosion did not produce spectacle. It produced compliance. The man did not recognize this as a system. He experienced it as common sense. As reality. He believed that effort led to security. That caution prevented harm. That reading carefully was sufficient. He believed that if something was dangerous, it would be marked as such. He did not know that the most consequential mechanisms were those that did not announce themselves. He did not know that the system he had entered was optimized for continuity, not correction. It did not stop when individuals struggled. It adjusted. It absorbed friction. And it moved on. When he accepted the new role, nothing in his experience suggested danger. He did not step into a trap. He stepped into a structure that had been operating long before he arrived, and would continue long after he left. The system did not require his trust. Only his participation. And by the time participation became costly, it would already be assumed. The opportunity did not present itself as a risk. It arrived framed as relief. By the time it appeared, the pressure he felt was not acute. It was diffuse. Nothing was wrong yet. But nothing felt settled. He had adjusted to the new role. Learned the internal systems. Understood the unspoken expectations. He was delivering what was asked of him. Still, there was a sense of imbalance. The work expanded faster than the definition of the role. Meetings multiplied. Deadlines overlapped. None of it was dramatic. It was simply heavier than anticipated. When he mentioned this informally, the response was consistent. This phase was temporary. The team was in transition. Things would stabilize. Stability was always just ahead. It was during this period that the opportunity appeared. Not as an announcement. Not as a promotion. As a conversation. A manager from another department reached out. Someone he had interacted with indirectly. They spoke about alignment. About fit. The department was growing. They needed someone reliable. Someone who understood the organization. The role would be adjacent, not lateral. More defined. Less exposed to day-to-day volatility. It sounded like structure. More importantly, it sounded like control. He did not see it as an escape. That would have implied danger. He saw it as optimization. A way to reduce friction without disruption. The conditions were reasonable. The salary would remain the same. The title would shift slightly. Nothing about it felt like a step back. There were caveats. The transfer would require formal approval. Certain conditions would need to be met. There would be paperwork. That was expected. The manager spoke carefully. They emphasized that this was not guaranteed. But it was possible. And possibility mattered. He left the conversation lighter than he had felt in weeks. Not excited. Relieved. The idea that there was an alternative, even within the same system, changed how he interpreted the present. The workload felt tolerable again. The long hours temporary. He could endure, knowing there was a defined path out. This belief altered his behavior. He stopped pushing back. Stopped questioning scope. He told himself it was unnecessary now. Why create friction when a solution was already forming? He shared the news cautiously. A colleague nodded, non-committal. Transfers were complicated. Another colleague warned him not to rely on verbal assurances. He acknowledged that. Of course. He had no intention of being careless. But nothing suggested urgency. The manager followed up a week later. There were details to clarify. Timelines to align. Human resources would need to be involved. Nothing unusual. Then came the document. It arrived as an attachment. Brief explanation in the email body. This was not a contract. Just an acknowledgement. It outlined the conditions under which a transfer could occur. The obligations during the interim period. The expectations of availability. He read it more carefully than earlier documents. Some clauses were familiar. Others were not. They were framed neutrally. Operational language. Temporary commitments. Nothing alarming. There was a section about continuity. Another about performance metrics during the transition. It made sense. A system needed consistency while adjusting. He noticed one clause that limited certain options during the interim. It was phrased broadly. He paused. But the clause was conditional. Only active if the transfer proceeded. And the transfer was the goal. He assumed that if the transfer did not happen, the clause would dissolve. This assumption was not stated anywhere. But it felt reasonable. He considered asking for clarification. But the context discouraged it. The document was presented as procedural. A step forward. Asking too many questions might suggest uncertainty. Or reluctance. He did not want to jeopardize the opportunity. He signed. There was no immediate effect. The next days passed normally. He continued working. Attending meetings. But his interpretation of events shifted. Every inconvenience became temporary. Every demand part of a transition. He was no longer enduring pressure for its own sake. He was enduring it for resolution. The system adjusted accordingly. Requests increased. Timelines tightened. He was asked to demonstrate flexibility. Commitment. After all, he was being considered for something else. This logic felt fair. If anything, it felt earned. The transfer process moved slowly. Approvals took time. Reviews were required. Weeks passed. He did not follow up aggressively. He did not want to appear impatient. He focused on performing well. Making himself indispensable. The more he did, the more the system relied on him. Responsibilities accumulated. Not permanently, temporarily. Always temporarily. He noticed that the boundaries of his role had become less clear. But he tolerated it. He was already halfway out. Except he wasn't. The first sign of friction came quietly. A meeting was postponed. No new date scheduled. An email went unanswered. He assumed delays were normal. Organizations moved slowly. Then a change in tone. The manager who had initiated the conversation became less specific. Still supportive. But vague. There were shifting priorities. Budget considerations. Nothing was cancelled. Nothing was confirmed. He asked once, carefully, about timing. The response emphasized patience. These things took time. He returned to his desk with a familiar feeling. Not alarm. Suspension. The opportunity had not disappeared. But it had stopped advancing. He did not recognize it yet as a false exit. Because nothing had closed. But something had stalled. And during that stall, The commitments he had made remained active. The obligations he had accepted did not pause. The system continued to treat him as someone in transition. And in transition, normal limits did not apply. He was still performing, still complying, still believing that what he was doing was temporary. The idea of a way out had become the reason he stayed in place. The opportunity had done its work. It had absorbed his doubt. It had postponed resistance. It had allowed the system to tighten without opposition. By the time he realized that the exit might not materialize, the conditions under which he could leave had already changed. Quietly. Without announcement. And without any single moment he could point to and say, "This is when it stopped being real." The first decision did not feel decisive. It did not arrive as a fork in the road, with two clearly marked paths. It arrived as a continuation. By the time the transfer stalled, he had already adjusted his expectations. Not consciously. Gradually. The uncertainty had become part of the environment, like background noise. He was still being asked to perform. Still being evaluated. Still being measured against expectations that were no longer clearly defined. But he was no longer resisting. The idea of an imminent transition had reframed everything. He told himself this phase was temporary. That it would look different once the move was finalized. This belief mattered. It allowed him to reinterpret pressure as investment. When responsibilities expanded, he did not see exploitation. He saw preparation. When timelines tightened, he did not see disregard. He saw testing. This interpretation was not irrational. It was socially reinforced. Managers spoke in future tense. Colleagues referred to him as someone about to move. Even delays were framed as procedural. No one said the opportunity was gone. They said it was pending. And pending felt close enough. The first decision emerged inside this context. A request arrived late one afternoon. Not urgent. Not dramatic. A short email asking him to formally acknowledge an updated scope of responsibility during the interim period. It was described as clarification. Not change. The document attached was longer than expected, but not unfamiliar in structure. Operational language. Defined obligations. Conditional clauses. He read it carefully. More carefully than he had read most things before. There were sections that expanded accountability. Others that limited discretion. Nothing was framed as permanent. The language emphasized continuity and alignment. One clause stood out. It stated that during the interim period, certain external engagements would require approval. This included discussions with outside parties related to similar roles. He paused. The clause was broad. It did not prohibit anything explicitly. But it introduced oversight. He considered the implications. If the transfer went through, this would be irrelevant. If it did not, the clause would expire with the interim. That was how it was presented. He did not see this as surrender. He saw it as containment. A way for the organization to maintain stability during a period of internal movement. He weighed the alternatives. Refusing to sign would raise questions. Not legal questions. Cultural ones. Why resist now, when the transition was already underway? Why create friction at the moment alignment was being evaluated? He considered asking for clarification. But the request had come late in the day. The tone was casual. "This is standard," the email said. "Just to formalize what's already happening." Formalization again. The word carried weight. What was already happening felt manageable. He had not suffered yet. He had not lost anything concrete. There was no crisis. And so he signed. This was the first decision. Not because it was reckless, but because it was reasonable. It aligned with the story he believed he was in. A story where patience led to resolution. Where cooperation led to clarity. After he signed, nothing changed immediately. There was no acknowledgement beyond a brief confirmation. Work continued. But something subtle shifted. The language around his role became firmer. Requests were no longer framed as favors. They were framed as expectations. The distinction was slight. But it mattered. He noticed it first in meetings. When questions arose, people looked to him more quickly. Not because he was senior, but because he was accountable. The document he had signed had done its work. He was now the reference point. He accepted this without resistance. It felt like progress. The system rewarded this acceptance. Not with recognition. With reliance. He was looped into more conversations. Asked to coordinate across teams. He began receiving messages outside normal hours. Not demands. Requests. But requests carried weight when they came from the right place. He responded promptly. Not because he was afraid. Because he wanted to maintain momentum. The transfer still had not been denied. It was still possible. That possibility justified everything. A second decision followed naturally from the first. He was asked to represent the team in a cross-departmental review. This was not part of his original role. But it aligned with where he was headed. The meeting schedule conflicted with something personal. He canceled the personal commitment. Not with resentment. With the quiet logic that short-term sacrifice enabled long-term stability. No one asked him to do this. That was important. He chose it. This choice reinforced the system's interpretation of him. He was dependable. Flexible. Available. These traits were noted. Not explicitly. Implicitly. The more he adapted, the more adaptation was expected. Still, nothing felt wrong. He was tired, but not alarmed. The story he was telling himself held together. He was navigating a transition. Transitions were messy. He reminded himself that friction was not failure. The third decision came later. A recruiter reached out. An external inquiry. Not aggressive. Just exploratory. The role was loosely aligned with his background. The compensation comparable. In another moment, he might have entertained the conversation. But now, he hesitated. The clause he had signed came to mind. It did not forbid contact. But it required disclosure. Disclosure meant explanation. Explanation meant exposure. He asked himself whether it was worth it. The transfer was still pending. Engaging externally might signal lack of commitment. He declined the conversation politely. This was not fear. It was strategy. He was choosing coherence. He was choosing the path that appeared most stable given the information he had. Each decision reinforced the last. None of them were dramatic. None of them felt irreversible. But together they began to define the boundaries of his movement. He did not experience this as loss. He experienced it as focus. His world narrowed, but it narrowed around a goal. This made the narrowing feel intentional. Colleagues responded accordingly. They stopped suggesting alternatives. They treated his position as fixed. This was subtle. It happened through omission. Through the absence of options. By the time he noticed that fewer doors were visible, he had already chosen not to open them. The system did not force this. It allowed him to choose it. That was the design. The first decision was not the signature. It was the acceptance of a framework in which signing felt necessary. He did not feel coerced. He felt aligned. And alignment, once internalized, is difficult to question. Because questioning it would require admitting that the story you believed might not lead where you thought. At this stage, that possibility still felt abstract. He still believed that the outcome would justify the process. That what he was giving up was temporary. That the system would eventually resolve in his favor. He had not yet learned that systems rarely resolve. They stabilize. And stability, once achieved, does not ask whether it arrived through choice or erosion. The escalation did not announce itself. There was no clear shift in tone. No moment when the room went silent. No message that signaled a change in direction. What changed was density. More emails. More meetings. More dependencies. The workday began earlier without being scheduled that way. It ended later without anyone asking. Availability became assumed. At first, he noticed it in small ways. A message arriving just before midnight, phrased casually. "No rush, just when you see this," he replied the next morning. No acknowledgement. The following week, a similar message arrived later. He replied sooner. The pattern adjusted. Soon, messages arrived late because replies arrived late. Not because he had been instructed to respond. Because responsiveness had been established. This did not feel like pressure. It felt like participation. Meetings multiplied. Some were optional. Others were described as important. Calendars filled unevenly. Blocks of time disappeared. He stopped protecting certain hours without consciously deciding to. The interim period extended. No new timeline was offered. The transfer had not been denied. But it was no longer discussed proactively. When he raised it carefully, the response was consistent. Still under review. Still possible. Still dependent on alignment. Alignment became a recurring term. Alignment with priorities. Alignment with expectations. Alignment with availability. Each use of the word shifted responsibility subtly. If things stalled, it was not because the opportunity was false. It was because alignment was incomplete. This framing mattered. It placed the burden of progress on him. If he wanted the transition to move forward, he needed to demonstrate readiness. He responded by doing more. Not impulsively. Deliberately. He arrived earlier. Stayed later. He anticipated requests before they were made. He volunteered to coordinate tasks that did not belong to any one role. He told himself this was strategic. He was building a case. The system responded predictably. The more he absorbed, the more it routed through him. He became a junction. Not formally. Operationally. Information passed through him. Decisions waited on his input. Not because he had authority. Because he had availability. This distinction was never stated. But it was clear. Authority came with boundaries. Availability did not. Mistakes began to appear. Not serious ones. Delays. Miscommunications. Details missed under pressure. Each one was addressed calmly. No reprimands. No threats. Just notes. "Please be more careful. Let's tighten this up." Each correction was reasonable. Each one was logged. He noticed this only gradually. Follow-up emails summarizing conversations. Action items copied to additional recipients. The tone was neutral. Professional. Nothing suggested danger. But the accumulation was real. He began documenting as well. Saving emails. Keeping personal notes. Not for defense. For orientation. He needed to remember what had been agreed to. Because memory was becoming unreliable. The pace made it difficult to hold everything at once. He began sleeping less. Not dramatically. An hour less. Then another. Fatigue crept in quietly. Decision-making became reactive. He no longer evaluated requests in isolation. He evaluated them in context. Would declining this create friction? Would accepting it preserve momentum? Momentum had become the primary metric. He no longer asked whether something was reasonable. He asked whether it was necessary. These are not the same question. The system rewarded necessity. He noticed changes in how people spoke to him. Not hostile. More direct. Less explanation. Assumptions replaced requests. "Can you handle this?" became, "Please take this." No one checked whether he could. They assumed he would. And he did. Because refusing now would require explanation. Explanation would require context. Context would require time. Time was scarce. The interim clause he had signed remained active. It was no longer mentioned. It did not need to be. Its presence was structural. He stopped entertaining external conversations entirely. Not because they were forbidden. Because they felt irrelevant. He was already inside something. Looking outward felt disloyal. Even to himself. The escalation deepened through interdependence. He became responsible for outcomes that depended on others. When things went smoothly, the system moved on. When they didn't, his role was questioned. Why hadn't he flagged the risk earlier? Why hadn't he coordinated more tightly? These questions were not accusations. They were procedural. They assumed responsibility. And responsibility, once assumed, does not disappear. He tried to correct this. He scheduled check-ins, created trackers, added redundancies. This increased his workload further. But it reduced visible error. That mattered. The system values legibility. He was becoming legible again. Reliable. Structured. But at a cost. He no longer controlled his schedule. He no longer controlled his attention. He reacted. One evening, he missed a deadline. Not by much. An hour. The message he received was brief. Please prioritize this. No anger. No consequence. But the moment stayed with him. Not because of the error. Because of how quickly it had occurred. He could not remember deciding to deprioritize. It had happened automatically. His cognitive map was saturated. The next weeks blurred. He could no longer clearly distinguish one period from another. Everything felt continuous. He was always slightly behind, always catching up. There was no finish line. The transfer was no longer mentioned at all. Not cancelled. Just absent. He noticed this absence but did not address it. Raising it now would feel awkward. It would require acknowledging how much had changed since the initial conversation. It would require naming the escalation. Naming would imply resistance. He was not ready for that. He still believed that persistence would resolve things. That if he could stabilize the present, the future would clarify. The system did not contradict this belief. It allowed it to continue. Because belief sustained output. Eventually, escalation produced a shift that could not be ignored. A project he was coordinating depended on input from another team. The input arrived late. The delay affected delivery. He escalated the issue internally. The response acknowledged the delay but reframed the problem. Why hadn't he built in more buffer? Why hadn't he adjusted expectations? He pointed to constraints. The reply referenced responsibility. Not explicitly contractual, but implied. This was new. For the first time, his role was being evaluated not in terms of effort, but in terms of outcome. He recognized the danger instinctively. Outcome-based evaluation without outcome-based control. This was the inflection point. Not a breaking point, but a narrowing. He began to sense that even if he corrected everything going forward, the record would remain. The documentation existed. The notes. The summaries. The follow-ups. None of them accused him. But together, they created a pattern. A narrative. He was no longer just someone in transition. He was someone whose performance was being assessed under pressure. The escalation had completed its work. Not through force. Through accumulation. There had been no single decision he could reverse. No moment he could isolate. Only a gradual shift from participation to entanglement. And by the time he recognized it, he was already too embedded to step back without consequence. The system did not need to tighten further. It had achieved stability. And stability, once reached, resists change. The point of no return did not feel like an ending. It felt administrative. There was no confrontation. No raised voices. No accusations spoken aloud. It began with a review. Not an emergency review. Not a disciplinary one. A routine assessment. The message arrived with neutral phrasing. A calendar invitation. Several names copied. He recognized the language immediately. Process-oriented. Non-alarming. He prepared for it the way he prepared for everything now, by gathering documentation. Emails. Timelines. Notes from meetings. He wanted context. The meeting itself was brief. The tone was professional. Measured. They spoke about alignment again. About recent outcomes. About areas for improvement. No one mentioned intent. No one mentioned effort. Only results. A project had not met expectations. A coordination issue had caused delay. They acknowledged external dependencies. But they returned consistently to ownership. Responsibility was discussed as something inherent to the role. Not negotiable. Not shared. He listened carefully. He explained where he could. Referenced constraints. The responses were polite. They thanked him for the clarification. Nothing changed. At the end of the meeting, they outlined next steps. Increased oversight. More frequent reporting. Temporary limitations on certain activities. The word, temporary, appeared more than once. That was important. Temporary suggested reversibility. He accepted the steps. There was no reason not to. They were framed as support. The next day, some of his system access changed. Not removed. Restricted. Certain approvals now required secondary confirmation. He noticed it while trying to complete a routine task. The interface looked different. He asked about it. The response was concise. Part of the review process. He adjusted. Tasks took longer. Communication required more steps. Nothing broke. But the friction was new. He became more careful. Double-checking messages. Confirming assumptions. This slowed him down. The slowdown produced further scrutiny. Not overtly. Procedurally. He was added to more email threads. More stakeholders were included in decisions. Transparency increased. But so did exposure. He could no longer resolve issues quietly. Everything became visible. This visibility changed how errors were perceived. Previously, mistakes had been local. Correctable. Now they were contextualized. Compared. Tracked. He began to sense that the record was no longer neutral. It was accumulating. He asked about the status of the transfer. Not casually. Directly. The response came after a delay. The organization had shifted priorities. The role was no longer available. There was no apology. Just information. The opportunity had closed. Not because of him, explicitly. But because conditions had changed. He sat with that message for a long time. Not in shock. In recognition. The narrative he had been operating under had ended. But the commitments he had made remained. The interim clauses were still active. They did not dissolve automatically. They were tied to conditions that no longer applied. This was not addressed in the message. He asked about it. The reply referenced policy. The clauses remained in effect until formally reviewed. There was no timeline for that review. At this point, leaving became a different calculation. The limitations now applied without the promise that justified them. He consulted a lawyer. Not a dramatic meeting. A short consultation. The lawyer reviewed the documents. Nodded. The language was standard. The terms enforceable. There was no clear violation. He asked about options. The answer was measured. He could leave. But there would be consequences. Financial adjustments. Restrictions on certain roles for a period of time. Nothing punitive. Just contractual. He asked whether the clauses could be challenged. The lawyer was honest. It would be difficult. Costly. Uncertain. The system had been careful. It had documented everything. There was no single action to contest. Only a sequence of agreements. He left the consultation with clarity, not comfort. The point of no return was not a single clause. It was the accumulation of commitments that now defined the boundaries of his movement. Returning to his desk the next day, he felt something shift. Not fear. Finality. He was no longer trying to resolve a temporary phase. He was managing an outcome. The review process intensified. More metrics. More documentation. His role was reframed again. Not removed. Reassigned. He was still employed. Still working. But the work had changed. He no longer led anything. He executed. This was described as realignment, a way to reduce risk. He did not argue. Arguing would imply denial. He understood now that the system had reached equilibrium. It had adjusted to him. There was no incentive to change further. He noticed how conversations ended more quickly. Decisions were made elsewhere. He was informed, not consulted. The identity he had built inside the organization had been rewritten. Quietly. Without announcement. He was now someone under management. Not development. This status did not come with a label. But it shaped every interaction. He considered leaving anyway. Accepting the cost. Starting over. But timing mattered. Leaving under these conditions would raise questions. Future employers would ask. He would have to explain a story that had no clear antagonist. Only a series of reasonable decisions that ended badly. He hesitated. That hesitation was enough. The system did not need him to stay forever. Only long enough. The point of no return had passed. Not when the opportunity closed. Not when access changed. But when all available paths forward led through loss. From that moment on, every option carried damage. And choosing among damages is not freedom. It is containment. He continued working. Not because he believed it would improve. But because movement now required strategy. Time. Distance. The system had done what it was designed to do. It had absorbed uncertainty. It had isolated risk. And it had placed the cost where it always does, on the individual, after the moment when reversal is no longer clean. The immediate aftermath did not feel catastrophic. That was what made it disorienting. He still had a job. Still received a paycheck. Still followed a schedule. From the outside, nothing dramatic had happened. But internally, the structure of his life shifted quickly. The first change was financial. Not sudden collapse. Erosion. The bonuses he had expected did not arrive. They were not cancelled. They were deferred. Performance-related compensation was under review. That phrase appeared repeatedly. His base salary remained intact, but the assumptions behind it no longer held. Plans he had made quietly, upgrading his apartment, building savings at a steady rate, had been based on projected income. Those projections were now uncertain. He began recalculating. Rent became a constraint again, not just an expense. He postponed decisions. Delayed purchases. Reduced discretionary spending. None of this was visible at work. The system did not register restraint. It registered compliance. The second change was relational. His family noticed. Not because he told them. Because of what he didn't say. Conversations shortened. Details disappeared. When asked how work was going, he answered carefully. It's complicated. It's temporary. They're restructuring. All of that was true. None of it explained the weight he carried. His parents offered support cautiously. Not advice. They sensed that advice would not help. Friends noticed his absence. Not physically, he still showed up. But mentally. He was present, but distant. He listened more than he spoke. When work came up in conversation, he redirected. Not because he was ashamed. Because he couldn't explain it without sounding defensive. There was no story with a beginning and an end. Only a middle that kept stretching. At work, the consequences became procedural. He was assigned tasks that required little discretion. Clear instructions. Limited scope. This was framed as risk management. It reduced exposure. It also reduced visibility. He was no longer evaluated for growth. Only for consistency. He met those expectations. Reliably. But reliability without trajectory feels different. Time began to behave strangely. Days were full. Weeks passed quickly. But nothing accumulated. There was no sense of progress. Each completed task reset the day, rather than moving him forward. He found himself replaying earlier moments. Not obsessively. Methodically. Trying to identify where things had turned. Not to blame himself. to orient himself. But there was no clear pivot. No mistake he could isolate. Only a series of decisions that had made sense locally and failed globally. This uncertainty affected his confidence. Not in his competence. In his judgment. He began second-guessing small choices. Emails were rewritten. Messages reread. He delayed responses, then worried that delay would be noted. He corrected himself often. Not out of anxiety. Out of caution. This caution slowed him further. The slowdown reinforced the system's assessment. He was stable, but not advancing. At home, the effect was quieter. He slept less, but not because of insomnia. Because he woke earlier than necessary. The day was already present in his mind. He stopped exercising regularly. Not intentionally. Time felt fragmented. Meals became functional. Prepared quickly. Eaten alone. He told himself this was temporary. That once the review process concluded, things would normalize. But there was no timeline. And without a timeline, temporary loses meaning. He considered looking elsewhere again. Not aggressively. Just to see what existed. He updated his resume cautiously. Removed recent responsibilities that no longer applied. Added neutral descriptions. The process felt strange. How do you summarize a role that had changed shape multiple times without ever being renamed? He sent out a few applications. Carefully selected. The responses were slow. When they came, they were tentative. Recruiters asked about his current position. About why he was looking. He answered truthfully, but selectively. He avoided language that suggested conflict. Still, the hesitation was perceptible. Organizations are sensitive to unresolved situations. They prefer clean narratives. His was not clean. At work, the review process continued. Meetings occurred regularly. No conclusions were drawn. Feedback was delivered in general terms. Continue to focus on consistency. Maintain alignment. There was no mention of restoration. No mention of exit. He existed in a holding pattern. The short-term consequences were not dramatic enough to demand intervention. They did not trigger alarms. They did not invite attention. They simply restructured his life around limitation. He realized that the most difficult part was not loss. It was ambiguity. Loss can be named. Ambiguity requires endurance. He was not told that this phase would end. But he was not told that it would continue indefinitely either. He was expected to function inside that uncertainty. And he did. Because he had learned to. Because resistance would require energy he no longer had in reserve. The system did not need him to collapse. It needed him to adjust. And he did. Gradually. Quietly. By the time he recognized that the short-term consequences were becoming structural, they were already integrated into his daily life. Not as an event. As a condition. The long-term consequences did not announce themselves. They accumulated. By the time he recognized them as permanent, they no longer felt new. They felt normal. The first thing that changed over time was how he thought about the future. Not in dramatic terms. Not as despair. As compression. Plans shortened. Where he had once thought in years, he now thought in months. Where he had imagined trajectories, he now imagined stability. Not improvement. Not expansion. Just maintenance. This shift was subtle. It did not arrive as a decision. It arrived as a habit. He stopped browsing neighborhoods he might one day live in. Stopped calculating long-term savings goals. He focused instead on liquidity. On flexibility. On being able to absorb shocks. The idea of progress had been replaced by the need for resilience. At work, time produced a different effect. New hires arrived. Younger. More optimistic. They asked questions he no longer asked. They spoke in terms of opportunity. He listened without interruption. Not cynically. With distance. He recognized their tone. It was his own, years earlier. He did not warn them. Not because he believed they were wrong. but because warnings without proof sound like bitterness. And bitterness carries its own cost. His role remained stable. Not precarious. Not advancing. He was competent. That competence was used. But it was no longer cultivated. Training budgets went elsewhere. High visibility projects bypassed him. Not deliberately. Naturally. Organizations invest where return is expected. He was not expected to grow. He was expected to perform. This expectation was never stated. It was reflected in patterns. In who was invited to what. In whose opinion was requested. He was included enough to function, excluded enough to remain static. Over time, this affected how he spoke. Not just at work. In general. He became more careful with language. Less speculative. Less absolute. He avoided words like always and never. He spoke in conditionals. In contingencies. If this holds. If nothing changes. He no longer assumed that systems corrected themselves. He assumed they stabilized. This assumption changed how he related to risk. He became more conservative. Not financially alone. Emotionally. He avoided commitments that required trust in future conditions. He delayed decisions that depended on external follow-through. He learned to keep options open even when doing so reduced potential reward. This was adaptive. It also limited him. Relationships reflected this shift. He remained social. Maintained friendships. But intimacy changed. He shared less about his internal state. Not because he was closed off. Because explaining required context that felt too complex to reconstruct. He no longer wanted to narrate his life. He wanted to live it quietly. He dated occasionally. Nothing sustained. Not because of a defining flaw. Because he struggled to describe where he was going. Not geographically. Existentially. When asked about plans, he answered honestly. I'm not sure yet. That answer repeated. It became a pattern. Over time, it began to shape how others responded to him. Not with judgment. With hesitation. People invest in momentum. Uncertainty, when prolonged, creates distance. Years passed. The review process that had once felt temporary was no longer mentioned. Not because it concluded. Because it had been absorbed. His status was normalized. He was no longer under review. He was simply where he was. The clauses that had once constrained him expired quietly. No notification. No acknowledgement. Their effect, however, remained. The delay they had created had already done its work. Opportunities that might have aligned earlier had moved on. Networks had shifted. Timing had passed. He did eventually leave. Not dramatically. Not in protest. When he did, it was through negotiation. A quiet agreement. No admission of wrongdoing. No compensation beyond what was required. A clean exit on paper. But not in consequence. The next role he took was smaller. Less exposure. Less ambiguity. The pay was slightly lower. The hours more defined. From the outside, it looked like a lateral move. From the inside, it was a recalibration. He was not rebuilding. He was containing. He did not speak about the previous role in detail. Not because he feared it. Because it did not translate. There was no villain. No lesson. Just a system doing what systems do. Over time, the experience altered his sense of agency. Not eliminated. Adjusted. He no longer believed that careful behavior guaranteed safe outcomes. But he also did not believe that resistance produced justice. He learned that systems respond best to continuity. That once they stabilize around you, they resist change. He did not become angry. Anger requires clarity. He experienced something closer to resignation. Not surrender. Acceptance. The understanding that some losses do not arrive as events. They arrive as missed futures. As versions of life that simply never become available again. These losses are difficult to name. They do not appear on resumes. They do not appear in records. They appear in conversations that never happen, in moves that are never made, in the quiet narrowing of expectation. He noticed this most clearly when he was alone. Not lonely, just unoccupied. Moments when he had time to think. He did not replay the signing. He replayed the belief behind it. The belief that legality implied safety. That standard procedure implied fairness. He did not reject that belief entirely. He adjusted it. He learned that legality defines boundaries, not protection. That systems reward participation, not understanding. This knowledge did not empower him. It made him cautious. Careful in a different way. Less trusting of process. More attentive to leverage. But leverage, once lost, is difficult to recover. He did not regret every decision. Regret suggests a clear alternative. He did not know what he would have done differently. Only that the cost of not knowing had been higher than expected. Years later, when he thought about that period, he did not think of it as tragedy. He thought of it as a narrowing. A gradual reduction in the number of lives he might have lived. Nothing had been taken from him violently. Everything had been adjusted. Gradually. Legally. Without announcement. And that, more than anything else, was what made it difficult to explain. There was no courtroom. No raised platform. No spectators. No verdict read aloud. The truth of what happened existed elsewhere. It existed in records. In documents created long before any consequences became visible. In emails written without urgency. In forms signed without ceremony. When the situation was finally reviewed in full, it was not framed as a conflict. It was framed as a file. The organization did not open an investigation. There was no allegation to investigate. There was a review. A procedural examination of whether processes had been followed. This distinction mattered. An investigation looks for wrongdoing. A review looks for compliance. The file was complete. Every major step had been documented. Every change acknowledged. Every responsibility accepted. There were timestamps. Approvals. Digital signatures. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been altered. The documents did not contradict his experience. They simply did not include most of it. Fatigue was not recorded. Pressure was not indexed. Ambiguity did not appear as a category. The record reflected actions, not conditions. In the file, his trajectory was clean. A hire. A transition period. An adjustment of scope. A performance review. A reassignment. Each step followed protocol. No abrupt changes. No violations of notice requirements. From the system's perspective, nothing unusual had occurred. When external counsel examined the record, the assessment was straightforward. There was no basis for dispute. The clauses he had signed were standard. The limitations imposed were temporary and conditional. The reviews conducted were permitted under policy. There was no breach. He asked whether the cumulative effect could be challenged. The answer was consistent. Systems do not evaluate accumulation. They evaluate events. Each event, taken individually, was defensible. There was no single action to contest. Only a sequence. In legal terms, sequences are difficult to argue. Responsibility was distributed. No one person had decided his outcome. Each actor had operated within scope. Human resources had followed guidelines. Management had documented performance. Legal had ensured enforceability. No one had exceeded authority. No one had acted outside role. This diffusion was not accidental. It was structural. Accountability was divided in a way that prevented concentration. There was no hearing because there was nothing to hear. No testimony was required. Everything relevant was already written down. His own emails were included. Explanations. Clarifications. Context. They were preserved faithfully. They did not change the interpretation. Because interpretation was not the goal. Validation was. The system needed to confirm that what had occurred could withstand external scrutiny. It could. The media never touched the story. Not because it was hidden. Because it was unremarkable. There was no narrative hook. No misconduct. No exposed wrongdoing. Just a professional outcome consistent with policy. Even if someone had tried to tell the story, it would have been difficult to summarize. What would the headline be? Employee experiences gradual limitation of options after signing standard agreement. There was no audience for that. Public attention requires contrast. Villains and victims. This story had neither. It had procedures. The few journalists who did look into similar cases treated them as anomalies. Outliers. They searched for illegal clauses. Explicit coercion. Evidence of discrimination. When none appeared, they moved on. What could not be shown could not be reported. The system was not designed to be invisible. It simply did not produce spectacle. Its power was quiet. It worked through alignment. Through timing. Through making each step appear reasonable. By the time the full picture could be seen, it no longer mattered. The file was closed. Closure did not mean resolution. It meant completion. The record required no further action. No lessons were documented. No changes recommended. From an institutional standpoint, the process had functioned as intended. He requested copies of the file. He read it slowly. Not to find error. To understand distance. The distance between what he had lived and what had been recorded. They were not incompatible. They were simply not equivalent. The file captured structure. It did not capture erosion. He noticed how neutral language flattened experience. Responsibility adjusted, replaced months of overextension. Opportunity withdrawn, replaced prolonged uncertainty. Role realigned, replaced loss of agency. The record was not false. It was incomplete by design. Systems do not record what they cannot act on. Emotion cannot be remediated. Fatigue cannot be litigated. Only obligations can be enforced. The record was never meant to protect him. It was meant to protect the organization from unpredictability. In that function, it succeeded. The most revealing moment came near the end. A concluding note. A summary paragraph stating that all actions taken were consistent with policy, that no procedural deficiencies were identified, and that the matter required no further review. That was the closest thing to a verdict. No wrongdoing found. No harm acknowledged. The story ended not with judgment, but with confirmation. He did not dispute the conclusion. By that point, he understood the framework too well. The system had not failed. It had performed. What he had experienced was not an error. It was an outcome. One that could not be appealed because it did not violate rules. It only revealed what the rules were designed to allow. The file did not mention the future. It did not speculate. It simply closed. And once closed, it made room for the next file. The next sequence. The next set of signatures. The system did not pause. It never does. After the file was closed, nothing stopped. That was the most revealing part. There was no internal pause. No review of assumptions. No reconsideration of structure. The system did not mark the case as exceptional. It was processed, archived, and absorbed. New hires arrived. They were on board with updated materials, but not meaningfully different ones. The language was refined. The formatting cleaner. The logic remained intact. The same clauses appeared. The same emphasis on flexibility, commitment, and alignment. Nothing in the structure required change. From an institutional perspective, the outcome had been acceptable. No legal exposure. No reputational damage. No disruption to continuity. That is how systems learn. Not through morality. Through consequence. And there had been none. Within the organization, roles continued to shift. People moved laterally. Some advanced. Some stalled. Most adjusted. Those who left did so quietly. They did not file complaints. They did not speak publicly. Not because they were silenced. Because there was nothing concrete to say. No violation. No abuse. Just fatigue. Just narrowing. Those things do not translate well into action. Human resources logged exits. Conducted standard interviews. Patterns, if they existed, were diffused across departments. No single metric captured erosion. Turnover was attributed to market conditions. To personal choice. To timing. All plausible. All sufficient. Externally, the broader system mirrored this behavior. Across industries, similar structures persisted. Contracts became longer. Language more precise. Flexibility was praised. The burden of adaptability shifted further onto individuals. This was not hidden. It was normalized. Economic commentary framed it as efficiency. As resilience. Workers were encouraged to upskill. To remain mobile. But mobility depended on leverage. And leverage depended on timing. Those who moved early benefited. Those who moved late absorbed cost. The difference between early and late was often not judgment. It was information. Information asymmetry remained central. Organizations understood risk distribution. Individuals understood effort. These were not equivalent. The gap between them widened quietly. Cases like his did not appear in reports. They did not fit the criteria. They did not end in lawsuits. They did not trigger settlements. They ended in recalibration. One person adjusting expectations downward. Another role being filled. From a distance, this looked like equilibrium. From inside, it felt like attrition. The system favored outcomes that did not require intervention. Gradual loss did not require response. Only disruption did. And disruption was expensive. So the system optimized to avoid it. Those who adapted remained. Those who could not left. Neither outcome challenged the structure. They reinforced it. The language of choice played a key role. People had signed. They had agreed. The narrative of consent remained intact. That narrative was powerful. It prevented collective framing. Each case appeared individual. Personal. Disconnected. Without aggregation, there was no pressure to change. Even when patterns were visible anecdotally, they were dismissed as coincidence. Or framed as the cost of modern work. No one denied the cost existed. They denied that it was actionable. The system after his story was not harsher. It was smoother. Processes refined. Documentation clearer. Risk distributed more evenly. Not between parties, within individuals. Responsibility was pushed outward. Accountability diffused inward. This was considered progress. Those who succeeded within the system rarely noticed these shifts. They had momentum. They were not paused long enough to feel narrowing. Those who stalled noticed. But noticing did not create power. It created awareness. Awareness without leverage does not produce change. It produces caution. The system was not static. It evolved. But its evolution favored stability over correction. It did not ask whether people were diminished by it. Only whether outcomes were predictable. Predictability was achieved. In that sense, the system worked. The question was never whether the system was fair. Fairness is subjective. The question was whether it was defensible. Legally. Operationally. Reputationally. It was. And as long as it remained so, there was no internal incentive to reconsider. The man was not remembered. Not because he was erased. Because nothing about his case required memory. He did not disrupt. He complied. Compliance does not generate institutional memory. It generates continuity. The system continued. It always does. Not out of malice. Out of design. Years later, his life looked ordinary. That was the first thing people noticed. He worked. Paid rent. Maintained routines. There was no visible collapse. No dramatic before and after contrast. If someone met him without context, they would not think of loss. They would think of stability. His current job was smaller in scope, clearer in boundaries, less exposure, less ambiguity. The pay was lower than it might have been, but predictable. He arrived on time, left on time. He did what was asked. Nothing more, nothing less. No one there knew the full story, and he did not volunteer it. Not because he was hiding, because the story did not land cleanly. It did not resolve. There was no lesson at the end that justified the telling. When people asked about his career path, he described it briefly. A move that didn't work out. A correction. That was accurate. It was also incomplete. But incompleteness had become familiar. He no longer felt the need to explain what could not be explained efficiently. He still signed documents. Of course he did. Life required it. Leases. Agreements. Policies. But the act felt different now. He read more carefully. Not because he believed reading would protect him. Because he no longer believed protection was implied. He did not expect warnings. He expected consequences to arrive late. This expectation shaped his behavior. He avoided commitments that narrowed future options. He favored roles with explicit limits. He chose environments where ambiguity was minimized. These choices did not make him safer. They made him quieter, more contained. From the outside, this looked like maturity. From the inside, it felt like reduction. Not collapse. Compression. He noticed it in small ways. He no longer imagined radical change. He planned within margins. He did not dream of reinvention. He prepared for maintenance. This was not despair. It was adaptation. The kind that does not register as damage. The system had not taken anything obvious from him. It had shaped what remained available. That distinction mattered. Loss, when visible, invites response. Loss, when structural, becomes background. He did not feel angry. Anger requires a target. There was no one to confront. No single decision maker. No moment he could isolate and say, "This is where it went wrong." The system had not lied. It had not broken the law. It had not violated terms. It had simply followed them. That was the most difficult part to reconcile. If something is illegal, it can be opposed. If something is immoral, it can be argued against. But when something is legal, routine, and socially normalized, opposition has nowhere to stand. He sometimes thought about the meeting room. Not the documents. The room. The white lights. The table. The pen. Nothing in that space had suggested finality. That absence of signal was what lingered. He wondered how many others had sat in similar rooms, signed similar papers, believed, as he had, that ordinary decisions in ordinary systems produced ordinary outcomes. He did not assume they would all end the same way. He assumed most would not notice. That was the real continuity. Not collapse, but quiet adjustment. The system did not require belief. It required participation. It did not punish trust. It absorbed it. And absorption left no mark. When he thought about responsibility now, he did not think in terms of blame. He thought in terms of timing. At what point does consent stop being meaningful when information arrives only after commitment? At what point does choice become procedural? These questions had no audience. They did not belong in policy documents. They did not belong in courtrooms. They belonged in the gap between intention and outcome. That gap remained unaddressed. Not because it was unknown. Because it was inconvenient. The system functioned better without it. His story did not end with resolution. It ended with continuity. Another life adjusted. Another record closed. Somewhere else, in another office, under another set of white lights, someone was being handed a pen. The papers were neat. The language standard. The room felt safe. And nothing about the moment suggested that it would matter later. That was the quiet promise. That if nothing feels wrong, nothing is wrong. The system depended on that promise. And as long as people believed it, it would continue to work. Not loudly. Not violently. But effectively.